Okay. Hello, everybody. Okay, so good evening. This is basically my pregame show for IEM World Championships. So I'm here in Katowice with, by the way, I'm this camera here. I'm talking to this camera here because I don't have my cable here to essentially, like, hang on, let me cancel this. I'm gonna pause my. I wonder if I can close this. If I close it, I wonder if it'll affect the stream. Anyway, yeah. So this camera here, I'm basically talking to this camera here, so that's why it'll look strange because I'm not exactly talking to my recording camera. But here I am in Katowice. I arrived yesterday, and about how the split's been going and leading up to this event, and what my analysis of the playing field is, and then I'm going to do some VOD review starting tomorrow of our like key opponents here at IEM, and hopefully do a live Wi-Fi today. I do not have my cable with me. I left it in Finland, so there's a port sitting right there, and I can't plug it into my computer because I don't have my Ethernet port adapter, unfortunately. So yeah, so this is basically a podcast. I don't even know if you can hear it. I'm gonna check now on my phone the stream and see if it's like even showing up actually. Let's see here. Not exactly sure how to search for myself. Let's see. If I just go to my channel. Like if I go to my channel, it doesn't show me live. Maybe if I go just to a anonymous web. Twitch / Okay, we'll see if this works. No, I don't want to Safari. I want to open this in Safari. Nope, you failed. You failed again. Nope, you failed again. Well, that's kind of lame. Oh, yeah, I'm live. At least I'm live on YouTube. Okay. But I don't understand why my warning's not showing. On my stream, I have a big, like, Wi-Fi streaming. This is basically a podcast warning here, and it's not showing up like my actual stream. So I'm not sure what the deal is. But regardless, hello, everybody, and welcome. First, I wanted to talk about international events and prep. So there's this misconception in in like the League of Legends fan community that preparation for a match or an event is more possible than it is. So like a lot of people say like, oh, they didn't prep for this weekend, or they didn't prep for this opponent, or they did prep for this thing. And I would like to point out that training in most people's worlds is not a zero-sum game, meaning that you could always train more, you can always study more, you can always practice more, you could always put in a little bit more time researching, etc., etc. But in elite sport, and especially in elite esport, where there's a really low injury rate, so you can train many hours without getting injured, you could say, like more hours than you could train, for example, basketball without injuring your body. In a sport like League of Legends, where you can train these really long hours, training time is a zero-sum game. So every single minute you spend training one thing, you are not training another thing. And if you think about it, really, what you choose to train at any given time, let's say League of Legends is not a solved system, so we don't know the best way, essentially, to play the game, because it hasn't been around for thousands of years like chess, so we haven't determined the best opening sequences, etc., etc. And heck, it takes 10 plus years to even become high level in chess, and League of Legends hasn't even been around 10 plus years. So you can assume that we're getting better every single year, and that even the top people in the game are not going to solve this game for decades, even if it was already a finished game. And then League of Legends on top of that changes all the time. So essentially, it's impossible to, you could say, master. Okay, so every single time it's a zero-sum game. So every single time you're training one thing, you're not training another thing, right? And the thing that you choose to train determines what you get good at and what you don't get good at. So if you're a really good team and you have a really good coach, you end up training the correct things, and other teams train the incorrect things, or they train too many things, or they don't train the right thing, or they don't know how to train something. But let's assume that you have a good coach who can help control the direction of the training, and therefore produce behavioral and changes and habit changes and improved mechanics through training. Therefore, the things you choose to train, your game philosophy, determines your skill cap as a squad. Okay, so you could say, like in this open market, that Coma of SKT has the best game philosophy and trains the most correct things, and then other teams don't, right? So when a team decides that they're going to be playing this weekend against these opponents, they have to decide, are they training to beat this opponent, or are they training to win playoffs, right? Because there's not enough time to train both, unless the opponent they're playing happens to be a metric of standard play that will help them beat playoffs. So let's say that the opponent they're playing plays all sorts of non-standard comps that would do really well in a best of one, but could be adapted to in a best of three or a best of five, and thus be rendered meaningless through the ban phase. So then, by training up a specific composition that counters their composition, but is not a strong composition generally, or is more useless, like in for example, playoffs, is a waste of every single scrim that you could have been playing a champion that you might be playing later, but instead you're playing a champion that isn't part of that meta, is a waste, right? Because you might beat that team anyway if you played standard and they don't go gamble on it, right? So every single team in the game is always training for being the best League of Legends team possible, and not being the team that's going to beat their opponent this weekend, because we're all in seasons, right? But that changes when you get to the end of the line. When you get to playoffs, you train to beat the specific opponent, which means like you don't get to play the next match if you don't beat the semifinals or in front of you. Therefore, you train to, like, specifically for a comp that's going to work well into that opponent. And so ideally in that situation, that's what I do with IEM. That's what I would do with IEM. That's what because it's a tournament, right? So it's like you lose, you're out. You don't lose, you go on, right? So it's really good for events like this to have specific training for specific opponents. The problem being that as at G2 we were a late invite, basically because C9 ended up dropping out due to not having enough control over their circumstances, being afraid of kind of like the current political climate in North America, plus on top of that the massive time zone change and the massive essentially investment that they would have to make to come to IEM. And then just the sheer importance of the regular League of Legends right now, being that like if you lose, you're kind of relegated, and there's not a chance that they're going to lose. But I don't know if you guys remember how Immortals missed out on Worlds due to just like a couple circuit points. So imagine a team like C9 missing out on the World Championships due to the League of Legends World Championships, the one run by Riot. Just to the regular season really can't be overlooked. And given that like it's so far away, you know, I can understand their choice to like focus on things they can control. So all of a sudden, here we are at G2 with a late invite, and we get to go, but there's not a lot of time to prep because you know it's just so late in the season, and then in the IEM season, and then our opponents, like, we don't have a lot of data on them, right? So essentially, what prep means is then having a pick ban meeting and determining what kind of compositions we'll be playing into, like in a best of one, which is kind of like a gamble, kind of like a crapshoot, because you can't really adapt. And then trying to choose our best and strongest composition and trying to figure out a way to ensure that we can draft that. That's kind of how it works. That's what every single team does. And then every other team is trying to disrupt that best composition. And then you just try to be good at the game. And if you're better at the game and the fundamentals, then you end up winning. And if you're worse at the game and worse at fundamentals, then you end up losing. So that's kind of all there is to it for prep for an event like this that pops up at the last minute. Now that's going to change as the tournament goes on, because we're gonna enter like best of series. So we're gonna have time to not to adapt in training, but to adapt in pick ban, right? Which you can't really do in the best of one. But it's unlike another tournament where there might be a week between the quarterfinals and the semifinals, or the semifinals and the finals, where you can actually train specific compositions against your opponent, which is when it gets really exciting. Because essentially you guys can think of playoffs as the only time that teams actually train in order to beat just the opponent. Now that's not true in LCS when you're lower in and you have to scrape wins to just stay in the LCS, and your ambition is not to win playoffs, your ambition is just literally to not get relegated. Then what you do is you try to plan ways of you have to like get more creative. You obviously are not going to beat the team with being better at league and drafting standard. That's not going to happen. So that's when you train for specific opponents. And on the other hand, the strong opponents you're training for, so let's say you're Team Liquid and you're just like literally training compositions designed only to just like beat the team you're playing against. And actually, I'm pretty sure Team Liquid probably is still trying to get really good at standard. So let's pick another team that like has no hope and just needs to throw everything out. Who's right above them in the standings? I know Dignitas has been creeping up. I know there's Envy. I think Envious is down there. And you're like literally just trying to like not get relegated. So what you do is you kind of throw standard out. You say, we're not going to beat them standard. Let's train a composition specifically to kind of like throw them off guard and just be better at the execution and try to find a rock, paper, scissors environment for this one team. So the top team, so the team in the high in the standings, they are not going to train specifically to beat you. They're going to train specifically to beat playoffs, and they're going to count on the fact that their fundamentals are strong enough to weather any storm. Like, the reason that the fundamental meta compositions are meta compositions is because they are strictly more powerful than almost any other setup. So essentially, if you want to train against a meta composition with a strange one, you have to all in on a certain period of the game, like the early game or the late game or the mid game. And then you get a massive advantage at that time that is like is to the meta composition at other times. So then the job of the pro team is just to be good enough at the fundamentals that they weather the storm through the early game, or that they end the game early enough versus a late game team with the meta composition. But most meta compositions scaling and late game, because that's by definition the most successful way to win, is to like play offensive, defensive well, and then team fight around objectives when the game simplifies later in the game. So, right, so there we have it. About like how it is that people prep for match, and I see them a lot. And so leading into this event, I want to make sure that everybody who's a fan of G2 understands that the way that like really good teams prepare is by training to be at League of Legends in general and not training to beat a specific opponent, because generally until playoffs and then until world tournaments, that's a waste of time. And that there's not a lot of time to adapt and train in this particular tournament because we don't have like really good data on our opponent and then a week to prep for a best of 3. So what we're going to do is just try to display our fundamentals of the game. We're going to take we're like everybody at this tournament is just going to try to be better than other teams, like at League of Legends in general. And I'm pretty sure that then there's going to be some teams. For example, any team basically coming into the EU teams, so all the LMS teams and kind of the M19 with a lot of data, and I think that they'll be able to, like, more or less have a handle on play styles of some of the other teams. Our first test tomorrow is against Flash Wolf. Really exciting and really demanding. Like, it's the #1 team right now. I think they're ranked first, and so it's kind of like Battle of the Titans right on the first day. I think we're the 4th match. Not really sure. All right. What was the second thing I was going to talk about today? Let me think for a second. Oh, let me open my notes, actually. Smart, Weldon. Ah, yes. Okay. So one thing I want you guys to pay attention to is a statistic that I have heard bantered around by casters a lot over the last few months, and certainly last year with TSM. And that is the concept of average game time, or like ending up with a clean win. So in a clean snowball, in my opinion, this is a very misleading statistic to talk about, and a very misleading way of kind of like looking at fundamental game strategy. So I'll give you a quick example. Let's say TSM last year, one of the fastest average game times in the entire world across any region. And this was because it was specifically trained, like proactive. So one training mechanism that I implemented was essentially like, if we're not in a play at any point in the game, we're doing it wrong. We're not doing something right. So we essentially broke down the game from play to play to play to play, from like setup, execution, and then the advantage phase, and looked at gaps between the end of the advantage phase and the beginning of the next setup, and tried to eliminate those gaps and criticize them heavily after the game in order to make sure that we set up for plays immediately on reset or taking of advantage after the previous play, so that there was always essentially a further play going on, right? And what that results in is a really proactive and overpowering 0 to 20 minutes against teams that cannot play defense. And even against teams that can play defense, it's a lot of pressure. And especially learning in that offensive way to like push and pull so that you know when a play is not working. But the fact that you're pushing on bot tower, and then you decide, okay, this play is not going to go well, then you can back off and take free things like Dragon or Blue Buff as a repercussion of your pressure in the play. So this is a very, very sound way to play the game, and it's a necessary way to train the game. But if you train it first and you train that, you're not then training other things, right? So remember, this is a zero-sum game in the elite level of esport. It's like if you're training one thing, you are not training another thing. And at the amateur level, you can always increase your training and your volume and your intensity, but at the pro maximized, right? So literally, you choose your fate. It's kind of a pick your own adventure book when you're training, and if you pick the right stuff, you end up a world champion. If you pick the wrong stuff, you don't. So if you look at high-level Korean teams, what you'll notice is that they are very consistent in making correct decisions around key ways that you win the game. So the game is very complex at the start, and it simplifies greatly as it wears on. The number of things that are important drop